Imagine this. Overnight, Canada is no longer dependent on the U.S. to export natural gas. On June 30th, 2025, an LNG ship departs from Kitimat Port, marking a new era for Canada's energy sector. Heading straight into the Pacific, bypassing all trade barriers from Washington. This is not just a shipment. This is a declaration of energy sovereignty. Departure. For more than 3 decades, the energy map of North America was a single-line sketch. Natural gas from Canada simply flowed southward to the U.S. with no other option. It was a habit dictated by geography, history, and a somewhat naive belief that the Canada-U.S. relationship would always remain as stable as the steel pipelines buried deep underground. But like every structure built on dependence, it eventually began to crack. And on June 30th, 2025, what seemed like a technical event, Canada's first LNG shipment to Asia, erupted as a political symbol. It wasn't just about gas, it was about choice, a turn away from the old orbit. Canada was no longer the dependent younger sibling in the North American energy game, no longer resigned to prices dictated by Washington, no longer confined to cross-border pipelines that year after year became hostages to the whims of the White House. In the long-standing political economy of the U.S., trade has never been just about trade. It's leverage. It's threat. It's a bargaining chip for presidential terms. And with Donald Trump, that became clearer than ever. In 2025, Trump returned to the political stage with unapologetic intensity. Canada, once a close ally, suddenly became the target of angry tweets and letters laced with punitive undertones. A new 35% tariff was announced, not out of economic consideration, but as a strategic retaliation. To Trump, Canada was taking advantage of America. And with an America First policy pushed to the extreme, the energy relationship between the two nations spiraled into distrust and pressure. This was the backdrop that turned Canada's first LNG shipment to Asia into more than a story of technology or logistics. It became a declaration of independence in the form of goods. A clear message: Canada will no longer let its energy future be dictated by someone else's tariff policy. Before that, Canada had virtually no choice. Over $8 billion worth of natural gas flowed to the U.S. each year as if by default. But that default always carried an invisible risk. Each time Washington changed leadership, Ottawa had to guess whether it would still be favored. And when Trump returned to power, the answer became clear. No privilege lasts forever. In a world where energy is a tool of power, Canada had gone too long without power in its hands. Thus, LNG Canada was not just an industrial facility. It was a bold move to redefine Canada's relationship with the world and with itself. With the new LNG export terminal in Kitimat, the country could, for the first time, chart its own course in the market, without asking permission, without having prices imposed from the south. They had opened a new gateway to the open sea, stepping out of the giant shadow of the world's largest economy. When the gas ship departed from British Columbia, bound for Yokohama, it wasn't just a freight route. It was a strategic path, a different vision. It signaled to the world that Canada had chosen its own direction. Instead of begging for tariff exemptions, it forged a path where it wouldn't have to depend on them anymore. The June 30th event was just the beginning, but it was enough to change how Canada is perceived on the global energy chessboard. No longer just America's cheap supplier. No longer a resource buffer zone. From now on, Canada is a maritime energy power with direct access to the largest economies in Asia, with better prices, greater autonomy, and higher standing. In a world where energy equals power, Canada has finally chosen its seat, not in the back, but at the head table, breaking the monopoly. No one thought that a small coastal town like Kitimat with a population of fewer than 10,000, could become the focal point of a global geopolitical story. But that's exactly what happened when LNG Canada, a massive project worth over 40 billion Canadian dollars, was completed and went into operation. At the intersection of majestic mountains and the cold Pacific Ocean, a silent revolution in the energy sector began. On the world map, Kitimat might appear as just a tiny dot, but it is on that very dot that Canada has installed a sovereignty gateway for its future. This is not simply a liquefied natural gas export terminal. LNG Canada is a powerful response to decades of dependence on U.S. energy infrastructure. It is a tangible physical declaration that Canada can and will independently redesign the future of its national gas export industry. Imagine a nearly 700-kilometer-long pipeline, the Coastal Gas Link, stretching from shale fields in the interior of British Columbia all the way to Kitimat. It is like a newly opened artery, transporting resources from deep underground to the seaport, where gas is liquefied at negative 165 degrees Celsius, compressed to just 1/600th of its original volume, and made ready to ship across oceans. What was once invisible gas trapped in geological layers has now become a guided flow, with a destination, and most importantly, free from dependency. But what makes LNG Canada truly special is not just the technology, it's the vision. While many countries are still caught up in debates between development and environmental protection, Canada, from the very beginning, chose not to take sides but to find harmony between both. LNG Canada is a vivid testament to the ability to produce large-scale industrial energy with some of the world's lowest emissions. The air around Kitimat is not clouded by gas smoke. This gas terminal is powered primarily by hydroelectricity, the abundant clean energy source of British Columbia. In an era when ESG, environmental, social governance, is no longer a slogan but an investment standard, Canada holds a rare trump card. Another unique aspect is how the project was built, not by a single government or corporation. LNG Canada is a cross-national, cross-cultural, and cross-interest collaboration. Names like Shell, Netherlands, UK, Petronas, Malaysia, Mitsubishi, Japan, PetroChina, China, and Kogas, South Korea, have all invested, sharing risks, and pursuing a common goal: to transform Kitimat into a new starting point for the global LNG supply network. This is not just investment, it is a strategic commitment from Asia's energy powers. Canada, therefore, is not just a seller. It is becoming a partner in designing the supply chain. This never happened during the period of pipeline dependence on the U.S. Back then, all Canada could do was pump gas, send it to the border, and wait for the price to be decided by the exchange on the other side. But with LNG Canada, each export contract is a direct agreement. No middlemen, no interference from Washington's political hands. That autonomy is the foundation for building a new global position. Look beyond that first ship that left the port. Imagine a 2026 scenario. More than 170 LNG shipments per year leaving Kitimat, carrying not just gas, but a new concept of Canada's soft power. In every shipment is a gesture of cooperation, a testament that Canada can deliver not just clean energy, but also stability in a volatile world. And we cannot overlook the human element. Throughout the construction process, over 50,000 jobs were created. Nearly $6 billion in contracts were signed with local companies and indigenous organizations like the Haisla Nation. The indigenous community is part of the ownership structure, not just those affected. This model, in which indigenous people hold real equity, not only delivers social justice, but also elevates Canada's global credibility in the eyes of importers increasingly concerned with ethical sourcing. From a small town nestled between mountains and sea, Kitimat is becoming a symbol, not because it has the largest port or the most advanced liquefaction facility, but because it's where Canada chose not to follow the old path. It is living proof that with just one timely decision, strong enough infrastructure, and a long-term vision, an entire nation can change how it appears on the map of global power. And now, that map has a new shining star from the northwest, where cold gas flows are igniting a warmer future for the entire economy. From Kitimat to Kyoto, Canada's new map of power. When the first LNG ships departed Kitimat, they didn't just cross the Pacific with frozen gas cargo. They were bending the axis of global energy power, opening a new geopolitics of influence from Canada to Asia. Moreover, those ships helped rewrite Canada's role in a world thirsty for clean, stable, and ethical energy. Let's step back a bit. For decades, the United States was not only Canada's primary gas market, but also a strategic lock. Gas from Alberta or British Columbia had to flow through U.S. pipelines, take prices set by U.S. markets, and get caught in political barriers in Washington. That dependence meant that despite abundant resources, Canada was undervalued geopolitically. The country was almost invisible on the global energy map. But now, with LNG Canada operational, that map is shifting. LNG ships leaving Kitimat no longer head south. They turn west, going directly to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and potentially, in the future, India, the Philippines, or even European nations. This is not just about selling, it's about setting influence. Because in the 21st century, whoever controls the supply of clean energy controls regional stability. We are witnessing a strategic pivot. Canada is no longer a satellite of the U.S. economy, but is building itself into a neutral supplier for Asian economies. In an increasingly tense geopolitical context, where China and Russia weaponize energy, Canada's stability, democracy, and reliability make it an attractive choice. Japan is especially interested. The country has signed long-term cooperation agreements with Canadian firms, not just to buy LNG, but to ensure that supply isn't interrupted by political pressure from abroad. This is Canada's golden moment to redefine itself, not merely as an exporting country, but as a strategic link in the energy security architecture of democratic nations. In G7, APEC, and even in post-COP28 negotiations, Canada now has a tangible card on the table. Clean energy, consistent supply, backed by indigenous communities, and, most importantly, free of geopolitical threat. Imagine a near future when Tokyo, Seoul, or New Delhi face energy crises from Middle East, conflict, or disruption from Russia. Meanwhile, shipments from Kitimat keep arriving regularly, uninhibited by any external force. That is soft power, but substantive. That is why Asian countries, especially Japan and South Korea, not only invest in LNG Canada, but actively advocate maintaining strategic ties with Ottawa. They invest not for short-term profit, but for long-term economic insurance. And this is the most remarkable part. Canada doesn't need to compromise its values to gain influence. No need to reverse climate commitments. No need to impose coercive policies. It is building a new model of influence, where political stability, governance, transparency, and Indigenous respect become real competitive advantages. Indeed, the Indigenous partnership model at LNG Canada has become a benchmark for energy projects in Australia, New Zealand, and Northern Europe. From this perspective, Canada is not just exporting LNG, it is exporting a new idea of development: community respect, transparent governance, climate sustainability, and equal partnership. This is not just an economic model, it is a civilizational model. And in a world increasingly polarized by nationalism, protectionism, and competing interests, this model is being heard. From Kitimat to Kyoto, from Vancouver to Yokohama, an axis of energy and influence, is taking shape. And as LNG ships continue to dock, they carry not just gas. They carry a new Canada, not merely a supplier of resources, but a rule maker. In a world searching for trusted partners, Canada, quietly yet decisively, is stepping into the light. The price of independence, Canada dares to say no to America, but is ready to pay. No separation ever happens peacefully. Even when it's an economic one, Canada is doing something few countries dare to do, voluntarily cutting back its dependence on the world's largest market, the United States, and stepping onto a risky path to gain true sovereignty in the 21st century. But that path isn't paved with red carpets. It's filled with thorns, with tariffs, threats, and mounting political pressure from Washington. For a long time, the Canada-US relationship has resembled an unequal marriage. The US is the powerful husband, while Canada is the enduring wife, obedient, stable, and vulnerable. Nearly 75% of Canada's exports still depend on the US market. A small change in Washington's policy can cause massive ripple effects for Alberta farmers, Ontario factory workers, or Newfoundland fishermen. And that's what has always forced Canada to tread carefully, to keep the peace even when the U.S. imposes unreasonable policies, from softwood lumber tariffs to dairy import quotas, from beef restrictions to Buy American mandates. But starting in 2025, with a new wave of populism rising in the U.S., peaking with former President Donald Trump's declarations to terminate NAFTA 2.0, Canada realized it could no longer rely on the goodwill or mood swings of the White House. And so, a strategy of gradually distancing itself from the U.S. began to take shape, building new ports, strengthening ties with Asia, negotiating FTAs with ASEAN, boosting intra-CPTPP trade, and developing energy corridors to Europe. But like every divorce, the price is steep. In early 2025, Washington unexpectedly raised tariffs on Canadian steel by 25%, sending factories in Hamilton and Regina into turmoil. Then came unusually long customs inspections at the U.S.-Canada border, paralyzing auto supply chains between Ontario and Michigan. Canadian transport companies reported losses of millions of dollars per week. Meanwhile, farmers in Saskatchewan were denied barley exports to southern U.S. states. Not for technical reasons, but as part of a pressure game. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Trudeau's government, and the one that followed, understood this was no coincidence. This was a message, a way for Washington to remind Ottawa, no one leaves our sphere of influence without paying a price. But what's different this time is, Canada isn't backing down. Instead of calling for compromise, Canada hit back by upgrading transport routes to Europe via Halifax and to Asia via Prince Rupert. State investment funds, like CPP Investments, began pulling money from U.S. corporations closely tied to hawkish political circles in Washington. Ottawa also announced a review of defense contracts involving American equipment, opening the door to partners from Europe and South Korea. Canada's approach is quiet but firm, and within that silence is a deep message. We don't want confrontation with the U.S., but we will no longer accept dependency. This isn't anti-American. This is not letting America be the only option. Modern world history has seen many nations try to break free from the shadow of a superpower and fail. But Canada holds an advantage: a stable economy, resilient democracy, an extensive network of alliances, and especially an internal confidence among its people in the country's ability to rise. A recent Angus Reid survey shows more than 60% of Canadians support gradually reducing dependence on U.S. trade, even if it means higher short-term costs. That's the clarity of a mature nation, and the courage of a people ready to step out of their comfort zone. to seek a more worthy position in this changing world, not to sever ties with the U.S., but to be strong enough that, if needed, they won't have to rely on the U.S., Canada, and its new role in the global order. When Canada began its journey toward reclaiming economic sovereignty, few would have guessed that a country accustomed to the image of being gentle and neutral could become a strategic actor in the global game. But as history has often shown, nations perceived as on the sidelines can sometimes hold the decisive piece. And in 2025, Canada is no longer standing outside. It is stepping to the center of the board, not with weapons or threats, but with energy, diplomacy, and wisdom. Kitimat Port is no longer just an unfamiliar name on the cold Pacific edge. It has become the symbol of a new Canada. Canada not only as an LNG transporter, but as an architect of the global energy map. Asia, once dependent on oil and gas from the Middle East and Russia, now has a more reliable, geopolitically lower-risk alternative: liquefied natural gas from British Columbia. Japan, South Korea, and even India, economies seeking to reduce dependence on unstable supplies, are now looking north. But it's not just about energy. From Halifax to Vancouver, from Quebec to Yukon, Canada is leveraging its geography, a land spanning 2 oceans, to become a connection corridor between Asia, Europe, and Latin America. As trade routes through China grow increasingly unstable due to geopolitical tensions, and routes via the Suez or Panama face congestion and climate disruption, Canada is opening a new path, a cold-chain Arctic gateway, under serious study as part of a 21st-century strategy. At the same time, on the diplomatic chessboard, Canada is acting differently. No longer merely walking alongside the U.S., it is actively leading regional initiatives. Within the CPTPP, Canada plays a mediating role between conflicting interests, from Japan to Vietnam, Chile to Malaysia. At the G7, Canada's voice is increasingly heard, representing a stable, multicultural, trustworthy democracy in a world polarized by extremism and isolationism. Without explicitly declaring it, many international analysts have begun calling Canada the quiet France of global affairs. Not loud like the U.S., not as cold as China, but precisely because of that, of high trust. In negotiations over trade standards, AI, cybersecurity, or climate, Canada is becoming an ideal anchor for nations that wish to remain independent, yet need a trusted partner between 2 great powers. However, every new role carries responsibility. To maintain its standing, Canada cannot rely on geography or goodwill alone. It needs heavier investment in national defense, not just to protect itself, but to have real weight in NATO and the United Nations. It must ensure its new trade corridors are more than declarations. They must be infrastructure reality, with railways, shipping lanes, and policies to attract international businesses. Above all, it must maintain internal consensus that this difficult path is necessary. That if Canada wants to be heard in the 21st century, it cannot simply follow. It must dare to lead. From a nation formerly standing in the shadow of its giant neighbor, Canada is gradually learning how to step onto the stage. Not to compete for power with anyone, but to protect itself and to show the world that a country does not need to shout to help shape the order. Canada and the lesson for small nations. Amid the rise of superpowers, the global geopolitical game is entering a new phase, more chaotic, more competitive, and more distrustful than ever. In that swirl, small and medium-sized nations, often seen as buffer zones or backyards of superpowers, are facing 2 clear choices: either remain silent and be dominated, or proactively build their capacity to shape their own destiny. And the story of Canada in 2025 is a vivid illustration of the second choice. From a country long regarded as the shadow beside the United States, Canada has gradually broken free from economic and political dependency by making the most of what it has: strategic resources, a unique geographic position, soft credibility, and patience. It has not engaged in an arms race, nor followed populism, but has chosen a quiet yet persistent path, rebuilding the economy, dispersing trade risks, and proactively connecting with the rest of the world. Broadly speaking, this is not just a lesson for Canada. It's a suggestion for dozens of other countries, from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, from Africa to South America, places caught between the pressures of the US, China, Russia, or the EU, places where people are asking, can we survive and develop without being pulled into one pole or another? The answer is not simple, but Canada shows that it could be yes. If a nation dares to change its mindset. Instead of seeing itself as a victim of globalization, Canada has turned itself into a regional connector. Instead of complaining about tariffs and pressure from the US, it proactively restructures supply chains and diversifies markets. Instead of reacting emotionally, it acts with planning and internal unity. A prime example is Canada's response to the US tariff campaign. Instead of retaliating loudly, it chose dialogue alongside positive negotiations with other partners, from Japan and South Korea to ASEAN. It used its calmness as a strategic advantage to show the world that not every country under pressure must either bow down or revolt. There is a third way: independent, rational, and sustainable. What's noteworthy is that Canada did this not because it was richer or stronger, but because it had long-term vision and strong social consensus. Successive governments, regardless of party, continued key strategies instead of undoing everything their predecessors had done. Provinces and the federal government knew to set aside divisions and stand together in difficult times. And the people, from businesses to the working class, understood that independence doesn't come from slogans, but from proactiveness in every production, consumption, education, and international cooperation decision. If there is one big message the world can draw from Canada's case, it is this: no nation is too small to do something big. Greatness doesn't come from military might or population size, but from the ability to preserve identity, adapt to changing times, and step out of the familiar comfort zone. The post-pandemic world, post-old-style globalization, is looking for new models. Nations that don't need to shout, yet are heard. That don't need to stand in the middle, yet can connect everywhere. And more importantly, nations that know who they are, and don't need anyone else to define that for them. Canada is not a second American dream. It is writing its own path, a path that many other nations can learn from, moving slowly but surely, walking alone but not isolated, and going far without losing oneself. A quiet lighthouse in the world's storm. As the global storms of politics and economics grow more intense, from the US-China trade war, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, to the growing divisions within the European Union, the world seems to be losing direction. Amidst that scene, there is one country that, without fanfare or loud proclamations, is quietly becoming a lighthouse: Canada. In 2025, as the United States returns to an extreme form of trade protectionism, many countries fall into defensive positions or emotional reactions. But not Canada. They don't exactly dodge the storm, but rather learn to walk steadily through it. The way they responded to the tariff shock from the US was not through tough words on television, but through a series of practical actions, from establishing new transport routes across the Pacific to building export processing zones independent of the US border. Canadians don't shout about soft power, but the way they act is itself a subtle and persuasive form of influence. Instead of choosing sides in a polarized world, Canada chooses to become a bridge builder between East and West, developed and developing, old and new. While many nations are stuck in internal conflicts, Canada invests in international dialogue and takes on a mediating role in regional agreements, from the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership to global climate forums. What's remarkable is that they do all of this without losing their own identity. Canada maintains a strong multi-ethnic democracy, protects Indigenous rights, and promotes social equity while driving economic growth. In a world where many nations trade freedom for stability, Canada shows that it is possible to be both prosperous and respectful of human dignity. But Canada's true strength doesn't just come from its government, but from the spirit of its people. From farmers in Saskatchewan shifting wheat exports to Japan, to engineers in Toronto finding ways to attract tech firms leaving Silicon Valley, or activists in Vancouver advocating for responsible domestic consumption. It's a quiet but firm solidarity. They understand that 21st century sovereignty isn't just about borders, but about the ability to control value chains, data, energy, and knowledge. Canada is not a flawless paradise. It still faces internal debates, immigration challenges, climate change, and income inequality. But what sets it apart is its willingness to confront those issues head-on without blaming the outside world. In an era when nations are easily swayed by flashy slogans or pushed into axes of power, Canada chooses a difficult but honorable path: independence without isolation, integration without dissolution. And that's what makes it a model for a small nation daring to walk among superpowers, not with force, but with intellect, unity, and quiet resilience. If the world is an unpredictable ocean, then Canada, not loud, not aggressive, emerges as a steadfast lighthouse, illuminating a different path for those seeking an alternative to confrontation or submission. And perhaps in the future, many nations will choose to learn from this quiet but powerful way forward.